Every single week you hear us say that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. But what does the scientific literature actually say? Is there evidence to show how potent exercise actually is for your body, or is this just something that we say? Well, on this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast, we're actually sitting down with a researcher who studies how exercise affects all areas of your body, not just your muscles. We're going to cue our introduction, and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and today we are exploring this topic of exercise and health. Big surprise, right?
Shocker.
This is what we talk about week in and week out on this podcast. But today we are interviewing a phenomenal guest who spends her career researching this topic of exercise and health. She's actually in the lab doing the research, figuring out how exercise actually helps us be healthier. And we have her on our podcast for you today. But before we introduce our amazing guest, we have an ask for you.
If you are new here, old here, you've been around for a while, but you haven't reviewed us on your podcasting platform of choice, please take a quick moment to do that. If you didn't know, your reviews are actually imperative to help us get amazing podcast guests on this podcast. It shows that we're relevant, it shows that we're providing great value, and it also shows that we're still podcasting. So after this or right now, give us a pause, go and give us a rating and review on your podcasting platform of choice.
All right, so today we are sitting down with Dr. Rachele Pojednic. Rachele Pojednic, PhD, is an associate professor and program director of exercise science in the Department of Health and Human Performance at Norwich University, where she examines therapies designed to enhance physical performance, recovery, and healthy aging. She is also the director of scientific research and education at Restore Hyperwellness, a research associate at the Institute of Lifestyle Medicine at Harvard Medical School, and an award-winning faculty member at the Harvard Extension School. Previously, she was a tenure-track assistant professor in the nutrition department at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts. Well, Dr. Pojednic, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
My absolute pleasure. Psyched to be talking to you today.
Yeah, we're really excited about today's conversation. The first time I heard you speak, I was like, oh my gosh, there's somebody else that gets it, though. Thinking about exercise the way we think about exercising is doing so in an academic, setting, and, really diving into the research themselves instead of just reading the research and stuff like that. So I was so excited to come across your work and to, come across everything that you're creating. And I'm really excited to have today's conversation, in part to expose our listeners to hey, there's somebody else out there that kind of thinks like we do.
There's a lot of us out here. This is something that is a little bit frustrating to me, is that there's a lot of us in the research space, in the academic space, looking at exercise, and nutrition is kind of the other space in my life. Mm-hmm. For the most part, I say this all the time, is scientists are just terrible at Instagram. So you know that we're here, but there's a lot of people doing really, really good work in this space. So the more that we can lift them up, the better.
Nice. I love it. Well, I know one of the things that you talk about is hey, exercise is not a weight loss tool, and we say that as well. Hey, exercise isn't necessarily supposed to be the thing that you're doing, to drive your weight loss. But I want to know from your perspective, what you've seen in your work is well, if why exercise may not be the best as a weight loss tool, or why should it be seen as more than just a weight loss tool?
Yeah, it's such a great question and a really good point. And I say it all the time, stop exercising to lose weight, and read that however you want to read it. But exercise, as we know, or movement in general, it doesn't necessarily have to be super targeted exercise, although there's certainly benefits for, a really solid, progressive, periodized program if you're training for something. But just movement in general is so critical for our health overall. When we think about, the implications of what the muscle is doing, in addition to just being strong and being able to, move weights or pick up a baby or, carry your groceries, all those things are super important. But we also know that muscle talks to all of the other tissues and the organs in the body. And, when I say talk, we use this word in research, we say crosstalk, but all of our organs are constantly communicating with one another. So when you think about the muscle, we often in the exercise world and the sort of fitness wellness stage, which I've been a part of for the past 20 years, which I feel like is starting to really age me. And yeah. But we often think about it as a performance metric, right? So, we can lift heavier things, we can have a certain aesthetic, whatever. But really what muscle is doing is talking to your brain. It's talking to your bones. It's talking to your adipose tissue. It's talking to your gut, to your liver, to your pancreas, and really regulating a lot of the systems that our body need to survive and be healthy. So when we think about exercise and we think about muscle, we want to think about it so much more broadly than what we are building, at a rack in the gym.
I love that because I think, Charlie and I, we were constantly talking to our clients because we train people, and it seems like the big thing that people come to exercise for, if they're just starting, is usually like, I just need to get skinnier. Like I need to lose weight. And then we can sometimes convince them that like, hey, there's like a thing that's really great if you're strong. Like you could like travel and like lift your bag up and have confidence you're not going to hurt your shoulder, or like you could go hiking when you went to that really cool place on your vacation, or you could pick up your grandkids. But I love this next step because that is something Charlie wrote heavily about in his book, but it's like exercise does so much more than just help you burn some calories, which it does happen, although it's probably not like the best effective or like the most potent effective exercise. But it also makes you strong. But now I love this new layer of like, hey, it also like really helps your brain. It really helps your pancreas. It really helps and talks to your adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. And so I love that because I think that sometimes people feel like, okay, if I start exercising, I could see the next thing of like, I could lose some weight, or I could see the next thing, like I could feel like I'm getting stronger. But these things are so cool because you don't really see them, but like everyone that exercises knows that's happening because they feel them. But it's just not like the next like first step that we visually see. Like it's hard to grasp, almost like what you're saying. It's like the science that's hard to digest a little bit because it seems a little bit under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And how often do you get to talk about your pancreas, to be completely
Right?
honest? So yeah. I'll say too, to your point, is that the literature on weight loss and exercise is actually not terrific. And one of the reasons, I mean, obviously it's great, if you combine exercise and nutrition, we see that you have some, solid weight loss because you end up in a calorie deficit overall, which is how weight loss works. But the hard thing with exercise is anybody that's ever exercised for significant periods of time, especially if you just start exercising, you get really hungry because your body is trying hard to redevelop all of the tissues that you're breaking down during those sessions. And so it's actually pretty hard to, especially early on, really regulate the intake because you're just hungry. You need food to regenerate tissues. And so, so that's one of the reasons why weight loss is, it can happen for sure, but it's really not one of the primary benefits of exercise overall.
Now, one thing that you've talked about is this idea of myokines, and that being like a big driver behind so many of the health benefits that we see from exercise. Can you explain to us what myokines are in like really simple terms?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually something that I came across very early on in my academic career. I was at Tufts and I was looking at vitamin D and skeletal muscle. And, when you do a PhD, they say you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing at all. That's what I did with vitamin D and muscle. So we really, back in the day, we had this hypothesis that vitamin D was doing more across the body than just promoting bone health, which we knew, through its communication with calcium was really helping make your bones hard and solid. And so when I was looking at vitamin D, we actually came across this really fascinating outcome where, number one, we were trying to figure out, does vitamin D bind to skeletal muscle? And it turns out, yes, it does. And what we were trying to figure out is once it binds, and this is like literally 6 years worth of work, right? So once it binds, what does it do? And so I was really interested in the inflammatory pathways back in the day, trying to think about if a vitamin D is beneficial for inflammation in other parts of your body, could it potentially be for muscle? And this was in the sort of like mid 2000s, about 2008 or so. And what we found was really fascinating. There was this inflammatory marker called IL-6, which if you have sort of chronic inflammation in your body is elevated. And what we found, which was really devastating for us at the time, is that if you gave vitamin D to older folks that had chronic inflammation, their IL-6 actually went up. And we were like, what is happening here? And at the very same time that we were looking at this, there were these two really fantastic researchers called Peterson and Fabryo. Those are their last names. And what they were doing was actually showing, hey, there are molecules that are being secreted by skeletal muscle that are actually not having the effect that they have across the body. And IL-6 was one. And they said, hey, 6 is being secreted by muscle, but it's acting in a very different way. What's going on? And so when you look at inflammatory molecules, or the molecules that are secreted by your immune system, we actually call them cytokines. So cytokines are going to be these molecules, these substances that can be little proteins. They can have, sort of, they can look like hormones. We call them interferons, interleukins. There are growth factors that are going to be secreted by your immune system. And so this group, these Peterson and Fabryo, were like, hey, this is kind of happening in a really similar way in muscle. And they started to call them myokines. So myo is always going to be the prefix for muscle. So if you think about anything that's myo related, it's going to be muscle related. And they said, hey, these molecules that are being secreted are acting on the cells themselves, on the muscle itself. They're being secreted out into circulation. And this muscle is actually acting a lot like an endocrine organ. So we termed these little molecules that come out of your muscle when you exercise, myokines, and it stuck. And interestingly, now there are kinds of all kinds all over the body. So things that are coming out of your liver, we're going to call them hepatokines, things that are coming out of your pancreas. So like there are different types of kinds, if you will, that are coming out of every organ. But yeah, so myokines come out of your muscle. Again, it was coined in the sort of mid 2000s, and now we recognize that there's over 650 of them that are coming out of your muscle across the body. Yeah, so crazy cool.
Yeah, that's super cool.
So when a muscle is stimulated or contracted, it secretes this thing called myokines, and then you said it can present like a hormone or like a protein. Did I get that right? And so then what does it do? Like when it's coming out of your muscle, when you're challenging your muscles, squeezing your muscles, what is it going to do?
Yeah, super great question. So myokines, as well as other, cytokines, hormones, have a couple of different actions. So one we call autocrine action, and that means that it's acting on the cell that it secretes. So the cell will secrete it and it will follow that signal right within that cell. Then there's something called a paracrine action. And what that means is that a cell is going to release it and talk to the cells around it. So a cell will release it and then the cells nearby will respond. And then we have an endocrine reaction, which means the cell is going to release it. It's going to be put into the bloodstream and it's going to circulate all over the body. And so for muscles, we see that all three of those things are happening. You've got an autocrine reaction, a paracrine reaction, and an endocrine reaction. So it's acting in the cells nearby, and all over the body through the bloodstream. It is a very powerful effect.
That's so crazy. So you squeeze the muscle, it secretes this myokine, and then the myokine is going to act and kind of talk to the muscle that just secreted it, the cells around the muscle, and then all over your body. That's crazy. That's crazy.
Yep. Data too. So like this is kind of cool stuff that only since 2000, 2003, 2008 have we really realized what's been happening this whole time. We thought back in the day exercise was just good for making your muscles big and strong.
Sure.
Sometimes making you feel a little bit better. There was some good mood,
sure.
Like the old runner's high and all that has been documented for a pretty long period of time. And now we're realizing there's a very physiologic way that is happening in the body.
That's really cool. All right. So these myokines, what are some of the ways that they can affect the rest of the system, the other organs and things like that?
Yeah, super great question. So if we start at the smallest level, so this is the autocrine reaction, is so that now the muscle is releasing the cell and it's talking to the cell in the muscle itself. Typically what this is going to do is be responsible for an anabolic response. So this is going to be making your muscle bigger or impeding your muscle from getting larger, because you don't want muscle and tissue growth to just sort of like be happening willy-nilly, right? So we have these interleukins, and if you look in the literature, they're all numbered. So it's like IL-6, IL-7, IL-15. These are typically going to have that growth effect by talking to other organs. So these are, we call it a cascade. So an IL-6 will talk to another molecule, which will talk to another molecule, which will talk to your DNA eventually, right? Which will help protein synthesis, which is hypertrophy, which is the anabolic response. There's another really interesting myokine called myostatin that is going to impede growth. And so this essentially makes sure that your muscles don't get too large and you don't end up with weird things like tumors or like unregulated growth. So you want this balance. You want this yin and yang of things that are helpful, and then also the off switch on the other side.
Interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's the first one. It's called myogenesis. So that's going to be making new muscle, myogenesis. We're very unclever in the scientific. We like to rely on sort of easy terminology. So we go.
Let's break the word down. That's what it means.
It makes it easier to understand.
Yeah.
Exactly. So we don't use buzzwords in the scientific space. The other thing that's really cool that happens right in the muscle cell is going to have a lot to do with fuel metabolism. So right within the cell, you're going to use sugar, glucose, or fat as a fuel in order to create ATP so that you can keep contracting your muscle. And so there are going to be all kinds of myokines that will do that. IL-6 is one of the ones to remember. This is the one that's like in circulation, it can be a pro-inflammatory marker, but in the muscle, it's got a totally different role. And one of the interesting roles that it has in the muscle is actually to help with glucose and fat utilization so that you can create ATP so that you can keep going. So those are the things that are happening right in the muscle. And then you've got a whole bunch of other things that are happening. So when we're looking at the myokines that are released, they can talk to your bone and help with bone formation. They can talk to your liver. And again, this is going to be glucose metabolism, fuel utilization. It can talk to your pancreas. Here we are talking about the pancreas again. That's going to help secrete insulin. It talks to your gut in order to suppress or increase appetite. So again, this regulatory element of if you exercise really hard, you want to increase appetite so your body knows to replace those proteins and fuels. Or if you've been sedentary for a couple of days, what we see is that it can actually tell your gut, hey, you don't need a lot of food right now. And it helps to regulate that balance. So lots of really, really cool crosstalk within the cell and then also throughout the system.
One thing you said that I'm like jazzed about is so another reason, like in the space where we work with helping people exercise, they always come in for a reason, right? And one reason I wish more people would start exercising for is when they become insulin resistant or are on their way to type 2 diabetes. And I'm like, a lot of my clients will say, oh yeah, I just need to stop eating sugar and stop eating carbs. I'm like, well, sure, but what about exercise? Like, you got to squeeze your muscles. They've got to suck up all this glucose. So I love that you mentioned that, because that's one thing that gets me pretty fired up. Was like, okay, we're only talking about half the story, like what you're putting in, but we can also talk about what your body is doing and what demands we're asking of your muscles. And that can change the story for people as well.
100%. And actually, I would say that's one of the most potent reasons to exercise is glucose metabolism. Whether or not you have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, is that this upregulation of the insulin receptor pathway. And it's funny, I work with physicians a lot and teach them about how powerful exercise and nutrition are, because a lot of physicians, unfortunately, don't get this in training. And when I show them that pathway of the insulin receptor, the GLUT4 going up, being a completely independent pathway when you exercise, so it's actually calcium mediated when you exercise. And they're like, we've been prescribing all these pharmaceuticals that are basically trying to do what exercise can do in a separate pathway. And like their minds are just blown. So yeah, I think that that is just one of the best ways that we can think about exercise is, yes, of course, it's talking to all these other tissues, but one of the diseases of our time right now is type 2 diabetes, and then sort of the down effects of that. And yeah, exercise is going to be one of the best ways to suck that glucose out of the bloodstream and make the tissue really understand how to use that fuel in a really efficient way. So 100%.
That's awesome. Now, is it any type of exercise will start to get these effects, or are some ways of exercising more effective than others? What have you seen? What's been your experience?
Yeah, such a great question. So the literature right now is kind of all over the place as to what the concentrations of these specific myokines are when we do certain types of exercise. So the reason for this essentially is it's really hard to study this. So if you think about how to study a myokine, let's say we want to understand if it's having an effect in the cell. The only way that we have to do that right now is to take a muscle biopsy.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah. It's like if you hold up your pinky, it's like a needle about the size of the pinky. Yeah. And so basically we exercise somebody, we jam a needle into their quadricep or into their muscle, and we take out a little sample. We got to take it down to the lab. We have to freeze it right away. We slice it up super thin, and then we put it on we either mash it up and analyze it that way, or you can look at it in microscope.
So no one signs up to do this.
This is why it's only college kids that sign up, because you get to pay them with pizza. And they're like, yeah, I'll do that.
Students, exactly. Yeah, this is what.
Oh my gosh, that sounds horrible.
I know.
This is the real challenge is that, like, let's say, for example, we wanted to use an elite power lifter or an elite runner or something. Doing that kind of experiment would be super cool. But if they're in a training period, we don't want to be doing that. If they, they're just kind of like, this is not a great idea for what I do for a living, those kinds of things. It's really hard to study. So this is why the data is kind of all over the place, is that if we want to understand what's happening at the cellular level, it's really challenging. So when we say like how much of a myokine is being released, we can pretty much across the board say it doesn't matter what kind of exercise you're doing, as long as, I love that you say, as long as you're squeezing your muscles, as long as you're contracting them, you're going to get this kind of release. It is likely that there is differences between different types of exercise, different intensities of exercise, different frequencies. So if you think about like, I exercised really hard for 4 days, the damage that you're going to do to your muscle is going to be really different. So yes, I would imagine, and I would hypothesize that there is going to be some kind of a dose response between the type of exercise, the frequency, the intensity, but we don't really have enough data to say exactly what's happening there. The other thing that I would say is, when we think about the endocrine response, so this is like being secreted out into the blood, this is where we have a little bit better data because it's not as hard to collect blood. But the problem is we can show that it's in the blood. We can show it's probably going to the target tissue, but we're not 100% certain exactly what it's doing once it gets there. So a really good example is brain, right? So we know that the muscle is communicating with the brain 100%. And so we've got a lot of different models, animal models, whatever, to show that this is happening. We've, shown that these molecules definitely travel to the brain, probably across the blood-brain barrier. But you can't do a biopsy of a human brain. So this is another challenge, is we have to create these models, animal models. We use different chip models, cell in vitro stuff, to really understand like what could potentially be happening. So I I would love to say, hey, we know exactly what all these myokines are doing. They're amazing. They're having all these beneficial effects. And they are. But the best way that we have to study it on the back end is some of these clinical outcomes. So for example, if we say, okay, the muscle is releasing certain molecules that are going to travel to the brain. One of the best ways that we have is like we measure depression, we measure anxiety, and we can sort of like connect the dots, but we can't say this myokine is getting into the brain and it's having this specific effect on depression yet. So hopefully our tools will get better to really understand that. But right now we're just like, we understand they're there, we understand where they're going, we can use some animal models to figure out what they're doing, but in humans, the data is pretty slim.
Sure.
So is it the contraction of the muscle that allows this whole systemic response to happen, just the contraction or the challenge of the muscle?
Yeah.
Is that what creates it?
Yep, both contraction and sedentary behavior. So don't forget that. If you contract your muscle, then you're going to have this response. So your muscle is going to start generating an anabolic, cascade or whatever. But the other end is also going to happen. So if you don't contract your muscle, you're going to have kind of the stop side of the equation really with your thumb on the scale. So this is the catabolic molecules, the inflammatory molecules. So the ones that are like, hey, if we don't need to use this tissue, we're going to break it down. So it's a great question because it works on both sides of the scale. So yes, it's going to happen if you contract your muscles, but you'll also see the opposite effect and these sort of more detrimental myokines that are going to be released if you don't contract your muscles. So really.
So no matter what you're doing with your muscles, they're constantly telling your body stuff. And so we just want to bias the environment. What I'm gathering from this, we need to bias the environment we put our muscles in so that it's telling our body the stuff we want it to tell it.
100%. Yeah, exactly. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging like healthy, positive talking behavior of our muscles rather than sort of like negative self-defeating talk of the muscles.
Is there any indication as to if and how this may change as somebody gets older? Is it the levels change, like the amount of myokines, or whether it's more of the catabolic kind, or anything like that?
Yeah, such a good question. So you remember back when I told you about the vitamin D receptor that we were looking at way back in the day? So one of the really interesting things that we find is this happens when I was looking at my vitamin D research is that the receptor itself downregulates with age as well as that signal of the myokine. So this seems to also be happening across the board. So when I was doing my early work on vitamin D, we showed that in older adults that you would have a reduction in the receptor of the vitamin D molecule, and likely you also had reductions in vitamin D intake because you're older, you're eating a lot less, probably not taking a vitamin. The same thing seems to happen with the cytokines, with the myokines, is that with age, the first thing that probably happens is that the receptor itself starts to downregulate. So even if you are exercising super hard, the way that it's being received is not as robust as it would be when you were younger.
Sure. Yeah, and I can see that. To me, that makes a strong case for like, hey, start now. Like, don't wait till next month. Don't wait till next year. Like, start now. We're not getting any younger. Today is going to be when it's going to be most effective for you to start.
Yep, 100%. And then I would also add on to that, it's never too late, right? So one of the things that we found with our older adults in vitamin D receptor is if we gave people vitamin D and repleted them, the receptor started to respond. And the same thing happens, we believe, with exercise. So if you are 65 years old, you're 70 years old, and you've never really exercised or haven't done anything since you were, 18 playing football in high school, like it is not too late. Your body is going to respond. And that's one of the coolest things I think about this, sort of like myokine plasticity of the tissues is that if you put a stress on it, your muscle, your tissue across the board is going to respond, right? So even if you're 80, 85 years old, now is the time. Like today's the day. So
Yeah.
your muscle will respond. It's not going to be as robust as it was when you were 18.
Sure.
For those of us that are getting a little older, we feel that every time that we exercise. But that it is, your tissues are going to respond until they don't anymore. And when they don't, you're not doing anything either. You're dead in the ground. So literally until the moment your last breath, your tissues will be responding. So never too late.
I love it.
Have you seen any differences in just a potential for health changes depending on the intensity of exercise that you choose to do? For example, like someone that, like, I train a lot of women that are 50 and over, and they like are obsessed with walking, which I think is really great. I don't think it's the whole story, but doing just walking versus walking and weight training, or walking and I do a power walk or a run. So does the intensity matter at all? Or is that part of the confusion that you guys are still trying to figure out on the research end?
Super great question. This comes in two parts. So the first part for me is, and I will stand by this till the day that I am no longer breathing, is the best exercise for you is the exercise that you love and the exercise that you'll keep doing. So I think that is paramount. Is if all of the other things that I'm going to say next are, an exercise that you don't love to do, then it's probably not going to benefit you for the long term, because you'll start it and then you'll get to a point where you're just like, this is just not really for me. So step number one is find the thing that you love to do. That's not to say that you can't start to love other things if you try them. And this is where we start to think about what the specific effects of certain exercise can have on your body. So if you do aerobic exercise, cardiovascular exercise, things like running, longer distance swimming, cross-country skiing, those kinds of things, you're going to have a more potent effect on your heart, your lungs, measures that we take in the lab, like your VO2 max, how much oxygen you can actually use. That's going to be super beneficial for things like preventing cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, all of those things. But that's going to have a very specific effect that's different than something like resistance training. So resistance training, now you are lifting weights, you're doing your bicep curls, you're doing your squats, you're standing at a rack. That's going to have a very specific effect on muscle hypertrophy, on likely a different family of these myokines, because now you're having this anabolic effect on your muscles. And I think at the end of that day, you're going to be a better human to lift up your groceries. You're going to be able to lift up your kids that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were just running. So I think from there, number one, find the thing that you love. And then number two, probably think about what are the things, and to your point, like, what are your goals? Do you want to be able to run a 10K? Is that going to make you happy? Do you want to be able to pick up your 4-year-old grandkid that's, like starting to get a little bit too heavy for you to get up out of the car seat or whatever? And so I think that those are the things that, you want to think about how it applies to your life. I will say the best sort of well-rounded approach is to do a little bit of both. So if you have the capacity to do some aerobic training during the week, do some resistance training during the week, getting the benefits of both of those things, getting that metabolic flexibility where you can switch to a more cardiovascular effort, switch to a more strength-based effort, that's going to probably be the best way to affect your health over time. However, at that point, we're splitting hairs ever so slightly, because again, anything that we're going to do is going to be better.
Yeah, no, and I really appreciate you kind of starting off with, hey, start by doing something that you enjoy. And it's like, it's one thing to do a workout once, but really when it comes to health, longevity, it's a long-term game. So you're going to have to be able to come back to it. And so if you don't find something you enjoy, or at least start there, then it's going to be an uphill battle from the get-go. And then once you kind of prove to yourself that, okay, I can do this thing. Oh, I do have time to do this thing, or I can make time, in my schedule to do this thing on a regular basis because I enjoy it, then you can start to kind of tweak the variables, implementing a little bit more resistance training, implementing some more aerobic exercise based on like what you were saying. Well, okay, what areas do I feel like I want to improve? What are my goals? What do I think I need to, in what ways do I need to build up my body? So I appreciate that approach very much, very much.
And it's funny, like I talk about the way that your muscles talk to your brains in a very sort of, cellular, molecular level. And certainly that is happening. But I think you just pointed out something that's so important is there's this whole behavioral side of our brains that also are going to be dramatically affected by exercise that probably has some molecular connection for sure. But when you think about things like self-efficacy, feeling like you can, you can do these things, feeling like when you leave the gym, you're like, oh man, that felt great, rather than leaving like, oh, I don't know if what did I just do that felt really weird and awkward. Those kinds of things are also going to be health giving, for longevity, for health span, is that mental state that you have. And again, I'm sure that there is a physiologic and molecular connection there, but this is where, all of these worlds with exercise really overlap, is that when we look at, we call it translational research, where I look at the cellular part, somebody else is looking at the behavioral part, somebody else is looking at the nervous system part, and they all interact, they all talk to each other. And this is, at the end of the day, what makes us human, right? Like our muscles are talking to our brains are making us feel good, and we want to go back to the gym for more.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think on our end, where we tend to attract a lot of people with, joint issues or some physical barrier that they feel, I don't know if I could exercise, or exercise would represent injury to me, kind of changing their story so that exercise can now represent like, hey, yeah, you can do it safely. You could strength train if you want. It doesn't have to mean you're going to throw out your back. We'll teach you how to do it otherwise, but just that mental switch and the confidence and like, hey, this could be done. It could be applied to my body, even though I have this issue here or there. But what's exciting to us, I guess that's usually exciting to our client, but what's exciting to us, and then we think, well, now they can like regularly squeeze their muscles and like do their gardening and feel good, and like home exercise and lift weights and feel good, and get all those health benefits that, again, like aren't really as known as, the depth that we've been talking about. So that's super cool.
I want to know what else you found with your vitamin D research and that's effect on muscle.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that, but let me just put a pin in that for 1 second, because I just want to come back to this idea of sort of injury and inflammation. So this kind of goes to the idea of this IL-6 brain pretzel that we had that was, we know with injury, we know with aging, we have this chronic inflammation. IL-6 is one of the cytokines. This is released by the immune system that's going to be, sort of rampant in our body, leading to inflammation. Can lead to injury, can lead to aches and pains. It gets higher as we are sedentary. It gets higher as we get older, prone to injury. And back in the day, and not so long ago, you both probably remember this, is that we would sort of like relegate grandma and grandpa to the rocking chair when they got older, right? Where it was like, don't move around, don't do anything. And now we're recognizing, oh shoot, that was probably the worst advice that we could possibly have given to people as they're getting older. The best thing to do is to keep active. And one of these mechanisms is the anti-inflammatory effect that exercise tends to have over the whole body. So in the short term, you go and exercise, you lift weights, you go for a run, you're going to have a small inflammatory effect. You're going to feel sore. You're going to do some damage to your tissues. But what that does is it sensitizes your body over the long term to be able to handle that inflammation long term. So you've probably found this with your clients, is that they start out exercising and they're like, oh, I'm sore. I've got, DOMS 24 to 48 hours later, or whatever. And then 3, 6, 9, 12 months later, they're like, oh, man, if I don't exercise, I start to feel pretty crappy. And that's that interaction between this funny IL-6 molecule and the, inflammatory regulation of the body. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. One of the best things that we can do for aches, for pains, with good guidance, good form, making sure that we're on a solid program, is really to keep training and keep moving, bring blood to the tissues, bring these myokines into and away from the muscle. And that seems to be super beneficial for aches, pains, healthy aging long term.
Yeah, I find in my population, like 50, 60 and over, they do have this script in their head of like, well, exercise is good, but like not too much. And I'm like, well, number one, we never do too much. First of all, we're not doing powerlifting, Olympic skills. We're not training for any of that. We're training for health. And number two, it's like, it seems like every time we do exercise, your body actually feels better, not achier. And so it's so interesting that not only like we're talking about the research here, but the scripting we have in our head about like what we should be doing and like too much of that. But actually, like when we put it to practical use, I'm always telling my clients that like, don't we feel better after that? Like when you exercise every day, didn't you feel like none of your back pain came back? But then when we skipped 3 days, then it came back, So that's interesting that it's also backed by research in terms of the anti-inflammatory effect on the body.
Yeah, totally. And you said one thing that actually made me think of this really terrific study that we did at Tufts. It's still ongoing. We were looking at power training in older adults. So this was people that were octogenarians, so 80 or older, and they also had to be frail. So there was a very specific scale that basically they had gotten to a point where they were either had a disease called sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting with aging, or we had these markers of frailty. And we would bring them in and under controlled circumstances. So they were all on machines. They weren't doing like, cleans and it wasn't like that. But they were on, I remember this one woman, she was 92 years old and I was working with her and she was on a leg push, like a sled, where you lay back on it and your legs are sort of up above you. And we would train them to do more of a power style lift. And they would all come in, every single one of them. And we ramped them up, right? But they were like, I'll never be able to do that again. Like, that's just not something that I can do. And our hypothesis was that we basically, as you get older, you start to lose your fast twitch muscles. So these are the power muscles, but more importantly, you actually start to lose that nerve muscle connection with aging. And that seems to be the real trick, is sort of like reconnecting those two systems. So the nerve that goes into your muscle. And so this 92-year-old woman is down, sitting on the sled. And it was just like, all right, are you ready? 1, 2, 3. And she would just like, boom, slam this thing up. I mean,
yes.
45 pounds. It probably was not a ton of weight.
Sure.
Yeah.
But this comes back to the idea of confidence, of the plasticity, of it's never too late. And what we found was with that training specifically, and again, coming back to the idea that the best training is the training that you love to do and will keep coming back to. But with this particular training in this population, what we saw is that we could preserve that fast twitch fiber, that power fiber. We could reconnect the nerve to the muscle. And here's why that was so important. Of course, it's kind of cool, but also when you get older, one of the things that's probably going to take you out more than anything else is falling. And so what we found was that by training the system that would help you catch yourself if you fell, we saw decreases in falls, decreases in hospitalization, and then decreases in early death. So
that's awesome.
All comes together. And so kind of back to your question earlier, like what's the best thing to do? There are certain reasons why you would pick certain training protocols or whatever. And actually power training with older adults seems like it could be a really interesting thing to play with.
That's really cool.
That is really cool.
That's really cool. What, where do you see kind of the future of fitness and exercise going? Like, is there anything coming down the pipeline from a research perspective or that's happening right now? Is you're like, oh, this could have a really big impact on the shape of the fitness industry over the next 5-10 years?
Oh, I love that question so much. And this is something that I work on a lot, is connecting these two worlds. So I really have dedicated my career to bridging the gap between wellness and fitness and the scientific community. Because the wellness and fitness community, I mean, they're my people, right? Like I have been a personal trainer since I was 18 years old. I was just like super excited about this population of humans that are like waking up at 5 a.m. every day just to help other people get healthier and feel better. And then the scientists and the physicians on the other side that are, sort of dealing with the ramifications of not having a healthy lifestyle, and they don't talk to each other, right? Like, really don't. And scientists are, sort of like the wealth of knowledge, and we sit in our ivory tower and we write papers that nobody reads. And the physicians are the ones that are sort of like dealing with the disease later on in life, and they've never been educated on exercise and nutrition. And the wellness professionals are like over in the gym and they're like, hey, we're over here, we can help. And there's a real trust gap between all of them. And so what I really hope happens over the next 10 or 15 years is that this gap starts to get smaller and smaller, and that people start talking to each other. One of the things that I find really exciting is that my cohort of scientists and younger are really excited about partnering with the fitness and wellness industry, getting better at science communication, talking more about, this is what the data says. This is where there are gaps in the data. Like, tell us what you're doing so that we can investigate it. I think a really good example that I'm looking at right now is cryotherapy and these cold plunges. Right?
Nice.
Everybody's got a cold plunge. Everybody's like, oh, you got to go to cryo and reduce inflammation. It's like, well, if you're an exercise scientist, and we were just talking about it, like, you actually don't want to reduce inflammation like crazy, because we want those myokines talking there. And so what we know is that cold therapy reduces blood flow, reduces, the crosstalk between tissues. And what we're finding in the literature is that if you do cryotherapy regularly after you resistance train, you actually reduce hypertrophy of your muscle because you are blunting that inflammatory response.
Sure.
And exercise scientists, you're like, well, that makes total sense. But everybody else in the wellness industry is like, oh, but it makes me feel better. It's super fun. I feel like this super jazzed up experience.
You get something to post on social.
Yeah, it's an instant post. Come on.
Real, totally. So that's a really good example where right now a lot of scientists are like, hey, wait a minute, there's a time and a place for cryotherapy or cold plunges or whatever. But if you're doing it every time after you exercise, you're actually going to impede your body's ability to do what you're trying to do. And so that's where I see in the next 15, 20, hopefully sooner, because in 15 or 20 years, God only knows where we're going to be.
True.
Exercise GPT. The sort of sooner rather than later bridge that I'm hoping to see get built is a better conversation between the researchers, the medical community, and then the fitness industry that's really doing the work on the ground. And so that's something that I've really dedicated my career to. I've got a little company that, we're doing nutrition and exercise courses for fitness professionals that maybe didn't get it in their training, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. We all know what the data says, we know where the gaps are, and we know how to work together.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. Yeah. When I was going through my schooling process, I thought, I want to help people and I like science, so I should be a doctor. And then I realized, like, I don't know if I just want to spend 15 minutes with people. I want to spend 2 hours a week with people, but then you get into the fitness world and you really have to be proactive at self-education, because there's not a lot of, you really have to dig in to find quality information. But I was really hoping that you were going to say, like, we are creating a medication pill form of myokine so that not everyone has to spend an hour in the week. One of my clients a few years ago, he was like, what you really need to do, Julie, is like, come, I will show up. I do a blood transfusion of you that worked out. Like, I shouldn't have to do the work. And then I get like all the benefits and then I leave. And I would pay double for that.
Yeah, be careful what you wish for. That is definitely happening. Like, people are really using this model to understand how they can create a pharmaceutical. And honestly, that really stresses me. And I live in this world, but like, it really stresses me out. Like, I can't imagine. It would make me sad. This is just me, Rachele Pojednic. It would make me sad to not have an hour to myself to go for a run or a bike ride or get a lift in, just because there are so many other intangibles that go along with that. And, to think about like the self-efficacy piece, the behavior part, the community, like, that's one of the best things about the wellness and fitness, world, is the community, the friends that we make, the high fives, the sweaty hugs.
Yeah.
While I agree and think it's fascinating, and there are a lot of models talking about fecal transfusions and blood transfusions and pills that could potentially be made, it does worry me a little bit because I think lose a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I can totally see that.
So, Dr. Pojednic, where can people learn more about your work? Where can they learn more about your company, and the courses that you're creating, everything like that?
Yeah, I love that you're helping lift everybody up. I appreciate that. So my website is rachelepojednic.com. So you can find me there. I am at Rachele Pojednic on all of the socials. So Instagram and Twitter are my two handles. I have not delved into TikTok yet.
That's fair. We TikTok makes my brain explode, so I don't spend too much time there either.
So those are my two predominant socials. And also feel free to reach out. So my email is kind of all over the place. I love to answer questions. I love to have communications with people. If you've got thoughts or, there are things that you want to get up to together, I'm more than happy to reach out and be a part of your community.
Awesome. Right on. Well,
Great.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. The question that we like wrapping up with for all of our guests is, Dr. Pojednic, what is your definition of health?
What a great question. I think the definition of health is being empowered to make good choices for your body that make you feel good and strong and vital.
I like that.
Love
I like
it.
it. Yeah, so much. This was such a fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, this was just absolutely fascinating. So we really appreciate your time and expertise today.
My absolute pleasure. Keep spreading the good word. I really appreciate it. Keep connecting the dots. It's so needed.
Okay, Julie, I got to be honest for a second. Out of all the interviews you've done, like this was up there for me, like top 1, 2, 3. Like this was phenomenal. This was such a fun conversation that we got to have with Dr. Pojednic about how important exercise is for your overall health and well-being. So if you haven't already, definitely go follow Dr. Pojednic on Instagram. Check out her website, all the work that she's doing. Contact her with questions that you have. Definitely keep up on her work and the work that she's doing with her students to help us all be healthier, live healthier through exercise. I mean, that's what we're trying to do here. But like we said, she is in the lab conducting the research experiments and making this research happen that allows us to then go and spread the message and say, hey, these are the things you need to do. She is one of the people who is starting all of that work.
If you're on Instagram, make sure you share this episode, tag us, tag Dr. Pojednic. We'd love to see that you are listening to it, and it's a great way to share this episode.
So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that thinks that exercise is just about losing weight or burning calories or something like that? Share this episode with them so they can understand how powerful exercise actually is at improving the health and function of your entire body. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.